Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Please like and subscribe so I can tell more interesting stories. Now let's get started. My car gave up somewhere between cell service and the last gas station that sold corn nuts. A polite sputter, a slow death rattle, and then silence. I got out, kicked the tire like it was personally responsible, and looked around. Just miles of trees. California's endless northern forest. Pine cedar, and a silence so thick it had a pulse. I was about to try fixing the radiator with the skill set of someone who once watched a YouTube tutorial on bicycle brakes when I saw it, a thin trail of smoke rising just past the tree line. Not thick like a fire, but slender, twisting. Controlled, intentional. Maybe a campfire, maybe help. So of course I went toward it. The forest swallowed sound in the weirdest way. My boots crunched dry needles, but it felt like someone had hit the mute button. Every few feet, I stopped and turned around. I didn't feel alone, which would have been fine except I was supposed to be. 30 minutes in, and the smoke hadn't moved. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Let's just get this out of the way. I'm not a hiker. I packed a flashlight, 2 granola bars, and an empty hydro flask, because I live in the illusion that I'm always just about to start getting into nature. The smoke pulled me deeper. The light dimmed under the canopy, and the trees started to feel closer, like they leaned in when I passed. I don't mean metaphorically. I swear one of them moved. Then I saw her. She stood barefoot, one hand on a walking stick made of bone, or something that looked a lot like it. Her skin was streaked with clay, her eyes this strange reddish brown, almost glowing in the low light. Hair down to her waist. She wore layers of woven cloth bark, maybe animal hide, and she didn't blink. Not once. I froze. She didn't. She just turned slow and silent and walked into the trees. I followed. Maybe I should have been scared. Maybe this is the part in the horror movie where you scream, "Don't go in there at the screen." But she moved like someone who knew exactly where she was going. And I had nothing but time and a dead Honda Civic. The trees parted. We stepped into a sunlit clearing so sudden it felt fake, like a spotlight. She stopped at the edge waiting for me to catch up. And then I saw it houses, not cabins, not tents. Actual houses, small and round, made of thick thatch and stacked stone with smoke curling up from chimneys of carved clay. People moved slowly among them, wearing clothes that looked handmade and timeless. No phones, no sounds of engines, no metal, no plastic, just time standing still. One child saw me and ran. Another laughed, like he'd just seen Bigfoot. The woman didn't explain. She didn't have to. That's when I noticed every person who looked at me had the same expression. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Like I was expected, like I was late. A tall man with a necklace of feathers approached. He spoke softly to the woman again, not in English, and glanced at me like someone inspecting an overdue package. She nodded. He nodded. Then he turned and motioned for me to follow. Okay, sure, why not? They led me to one of the huts. Inside, it was surprisingly warm, even cozy. Animal skins on the floor, dried herbs hanging from a lattice of thin branches. A low fire pit in the center vented perfectly through a hole in the roof. A pot steamed gently, and the smell was somewhere between stew and sage. The woman touched her chest, then pointed at me. I got it. I'm Dylan, I said. She tilted her head. Dylan. Still nothing. So I did what anyone would do. I mimed it. Pointed at my chest. Dylan. She watched stone-faced. Then she pointed back at her own chest and said Soraya. Okay. Dylan and Soraya. Cool. Historical fact for your trivia night. Anthropologists have cataloged over 100 uncontacted or isolated tribes worldwide, many in the Amazon, some in Papua New Guinea. California is not on that list. And yet, here we were. Soraya gave me a carved cup of water, cold, fresh, shockingly clean. Then she left, slipping through the curtain of moss like a ghost. I sat, waited, looked around. That's when I noticed something hanging on the wall, a piece of animal hide etched with symbols, spirals, stick figures, what looked suspiciously like stars and moons arranged in a pattern. And in the corner, something that looked like a car, a literal doodle of a car. I stood up, stepped closer, and then I heard it, a voice not from inside the hut, but from the forest. Whispered words, in English. Don't ask them the wrong question. I whipped around, no one there. I stepped outside. Soraya was back this time with a bowl of something brown and pulpy. I took a polite bite. It was not great. Think cold mashed lentils mixed with beet pulp and mystery berries. But hey, protein. She pointed to a stump beside her, and we both sat. I tried again. Where am I? She tilted her head again, then said softly, Here. Cool. Super helpful. The sky began to dim. Not sunset dim. Like cloud-covered dim. Fast. I checked my phone out of habit. Dead, obviously. But even when it was working, I hadn't seen a bar of service since the gas station. Soraya stood. She touched her lips, then touched my forehead. Then she said one more word. Stay. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. She walked away. Here's your odd fact of the day. In the 17th century, Dutch mapmakers would sometimes put dragons or sea monsters on unexplored parts of the map because they honestly didn't know what was out there. That's exactly how I felt now. And you know what historians still debate? Whether it's possible for a completely isolated society to survive unnoticed in a modern country with satellites, drones, and Google Earth. Spoiler, they think it's not. But if you'd been there that night, sitting on a log in a place that shouldn't exist, holding a bowl of cold bug porridge under a sky that didn't look right, you'd understand why I stayed. The next morning came slow, like a dial turning up on the sun instead of a sudden switch. My body ached like I'd hiked a marathon in dress shoes, maybe because I'd slept on a woven mat stuffed with hay and moss. Not exactly posturepedic. When I stepped outside, Soraya was already awake. She was crouched over a small stone basin, grinding something that looked like acorns into powder. She didn't look up, just pointed to a basket nearby. Inside were flat cakes and a handful of dark red berries. Breakfast. Not exactly a grand slam, but I nodded thanks. Then she said my name. Well, almost. Daylan. Close enough. It felt weird hearing it from her, like your GPS suddenly gaining consciousness and calling you by name. She pointed to the forest trail. Walk. So we walked. I figured we were going somewhere with a purpose. Wrong. She stopped every few yards to touch bark, pick a leaf, or press her palm into the dirt like a forest whisperer. I followed like an underqualified intern. Then she did something wild. She pointed at a tree and said, Grandfather. I blinked, like, that tree is your grandfather. She nodded, dead serious. Okay. So, either this was metaphor, or she had an incredibly confusing family tree. Fun fact. In many indigenous cultures, trees, rivers, and stones are considered literal ancestors. It's not poetic. It's bloodline-level spiritual. I learned that later. At the time, I just smiled and nodded like a guy trying not to get kicked out of a very intense art class. Eventually, we reached another clearing. This one filled with carved posts, feathers, bone charms hanging from tree branches. Soraya walked right to the center, tapped her stick against the dirt, and waited. 3 more people appeared, like shadows melting into form. An old man with tattooed arms, a teenage girl with eyes like stone, and a guy who looked like he could bench press an elk. They circled me. No one spoke. I offered a polite hi. Nothing. Then the old man stepped forward, touched my forehead, and said a single word. Return. I laughed awkwardly. Sorry, is that a request or a command? Soraya stepped forward. He says, you return. To here. She nodded. You came before. As child. What? I'd never been here before in my life. But Soraya's eyes didn't waver. They remember, she said. Your scar. She pointed to my eyebrow. I've had a small scar there since I was a kid. Fell off a swing. Split it open. Nothing mystical. But now, 4 strangers in a secret forest village were treating it like it was a passport stamp. Then she said something that still gives me chills. You screamed at stars when you were small. I felt the breath stall in my chest. That had happened. I had night terrors as a kid, according to my mom. Used to point out the window and scream about the stars being wrong. No one ever figured out why. I never told anyone. So how did she know? Here's a historical nugget. In 1911, a Native American man named Ishi walked out of the California forest, the last known member of his tribe. He'd lived his whole life hidden from modern society. That's real. That's documented. But this tribe hadn't walked out. They'd stayed in, hidden. And now they were calling me one of their own. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. But I didn't say that. I said, okay, sure, I guess. The old man nodded, like I'd passed a test I didn't know I was taking. Then the teenager, she couldn't have been older than 16, stepped forward and handed me something wrapped in leather. I unrolled it slowly. It was a drawing, or maybe a memory. A child sitting beneath a tree looking up at a sky filled with spirals and symbols. Stars, but not constellations, I knew. They looked off, curved, dancing. At the bottom, a single word, written in English. You. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but all I could say was, who drew this? The girl tilted her head. You did. I didn't even know what language she used, but I understood it. It went straight past my ears and into my brain like a warm current. I sat down. Soraya sat beside me. You have questions, she said softly. No joke, I almost laughed. Yeah, just a few. She didn't smile. Some answers. Not for asking. Then, how do I learn? She placed a finger to her temple. Remember, this was either a cult, an elaborate prank, or I'd wandered through a rip in time-space and was now starring in my own indie Netflix thriller. Suddenly, Saraya stood. She walked over to the tall guy, the elk lifter, and handed him her walking stick. He nodded. Then she turned to me. Come. She led me away from the circle down a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before. The trees pressed in tighter here. The air smelled sweeter, like crushed fern and damp earth. We walked in silence until we reached a stream. Soraya knelt beside it, scooped up water, and poured it over my hands. Now, she said, you belong. Because of this. No, she said. Because you stayed. An odd fact for your next trivia night. Some frogs in the Amazon secrete a wax that acts like sunscreen. Nature's own SPF. That's kind of how Soraya made me feel, like I was being coated in something invisible but protective, like my skin had changed. Or maybe it was my mind. As we sat by the stream, I asked her one last thing. Why me? She looked at me for a long time. Then she whispered, because you came back, before you knew you left. And historians still debate whether memory can pass genetically, like instincts in animals, or trauma carried in bloodlines. Maybe what I thought was a nightmare as a child was just the forest calling me home. The days started blending together, not in a boring way, more like a slow dissolve into another life. I stopped checking the position of the sun like a clock. I stopped hoping my phone would spring back to life. I even stopped caring about the car. Wherever I had come from, started feeling less like a memory and more like a rumor. The village welcomed me in waves, not with open arms, exactly, more like suspicious squints that softened into cautious nods. They watched me work. They watched me eat. They watched me try and fail to start a fire using their method, which involved no lighters, no matches, just a string, a stick, and a prayer. One older woman, Tiha, I think, finally shoved me aside and lit the fire herself in 30 seconds flat. She grunted, handed me a piece of roasted root, and said something that probably translated to "bless your helpless little heart." It tasted like sweet potato and regret. They taught me small things: how to chew a particular leaf if you get stung, how to read the rustle of leaves to tell wind from footsteps, how to walk in silence. Still haven't mastered that. My joints pop like microwave popcorn. And they started telling stories, not directly, not in once upon a time format, more like songs or dances or carved scenes acted out with flat tone chants. Everything here was memory shaped. Their history wasn't written, it was worn. On the walls, on their clothes, in the firelight flickering across tattoos like stars. One night, I sat beside Soraya as she painted symbols on a clay tablet with crushed berries. Swirls, figures. A strange, jagged symbol she called the sky mouth. I asked, "What is that?" She hesitated, where the old ones disappeared, like died. She shook her head, vanished, in breath, like ascended. Another head shake, gone, but not dead. She tapped her chest. Still in here. Okay, cool. Casual post-dinner existentialism. That was the night I learned the tribe didn't call themselves a tribe. That's a word we use. They called themselves Eshonai, which she told me meant those who remain unseen. I asked her once if they were hiding. She answered with a smile so small it barely existed. "We are forgotten," she said, "not lost." There's a historical record of the Takelma people in Oregon who vanished from the census for nearly a century, only to reappear because one family kept the language alive in secret. Not lost, just quiet. The Eshonai were like that. Not extinct, not even endangered. Just not interested in being known. And yet, they let me stay. On my 6th day, the children brought me something wrapped in leaves. I unwrapped it to find roasted insects, crickets fat and glistening. Protein, apparently. I'd read that edible bugs are a staple in over 80% of global cultures. Still, I gagged a little. One kid mimed popping it into his mouth with a huge, exaggerated crunch and laughed so hard he fell over. So I did it. I ate one. It was not bad. Crunchy, nutty, like someone had over-roasted a sesame stick and added a hint of forest floor. They cheered. Then they dragged me to the center of the village where a group had gathered around a fire. A ring of people sat cross-legged while others stood holding carved masks, each one different. Animals, faces, suns, moons. The tall elk-lifting guy from earlier stepped into the ring and said something in a booming voice. Everyone looked at me. Soraya whispered, "Now your test. Test. You stay, you join. You join, you pass. No pressure." They gave me a mask. A spiral one. Swirls like stars. Then they told me without words to dance. So I danced. Look, I'm not a dancer. I'm the kind of guy who sways at weddings like I'm trying to keep warm without alarming anyone. But that night, something strange took over. The drum beats, the chants, the scent of burning herbs. I moved like I had done it before. Not perfectly, not even gracefully, but like I wasn't afraid to look ridiculous. They didn't laugh. They joined me. One elder, covered in more tattoos than skin, held up a rattle made of bone and seed pods. She shook it in rhythm and shouted something that made everyone repeat it in chorus. I didn't know the words, but I knew what they meant. Afterward, they painted 3 lines on my face. Soraya explained softly, One for now, one for before, and one for after. I'd officially become something. Not quite one of them. Not quite a visitor. Something in between. An odd fact. Otzi the Iceman found in the Alps had over 60 tattoos, most of them near joints. Some historians believe they were therapeutic, like early acupuncture. The Esh and I believed in that too. They didn't just decorate skin, they mapped memories. And historians still debate whether oral traditions can be more accurate than written ones. After living here for a week, I had my opinion. They don't forget, not anything. Later, Soraya handed me a stone wrapped in cord. A necklace. It is yours, she said. You carried it once. I stared at it. It felt familiar. I don't have an explanation. But when I put it on, I felt my heart stutter. Like something locked had clicked open. And in that moment, under stars that curved and twisted like a language, I almost understood. I started to believe her. The next morning started with smoke. Not from firewood. This was different. Acrid, sharp. It clung to the back of my throat like regret. I stepped outside to see Soraya and 3 others drawing a thick circle around the village with crushed ash and herb bundles. A kind of ritual perimeter. The kids weren't allowed to cross it. The animals wouldn't even go near it. Something was happening. Soraya didn't explain, but she didn't have to. Every movement was heavier. Every glance between the villagers meant something unspoken, something old. She handed me a bundle wrapped in leaves. Inside were roasted roots, crushed berries, and 3 insects that looked suspiciously like hornet larvae. Breakfast of champions. I ate it because I was learning that no thank you wasn't really a thing here. You eat what you're given. You carry what you're handed. You ask permission for everything else. And then, of course, they told me I had to pass another test, because nothing says welcome like the ongoing suspicion that you're still unworthy. I was brought to a clearing with 6 others. Each person held something strange. One had a bundle of sticks. Another carried a jar of thick green goo. One man, barefoot, white-haired, held a live snake. Just casually, like it was a scarf. Soraya stepped forward. You must choose, she said. Only one. What am I choosing? She tilted her head. What you fear least. Okay. I love multiple choice. But none of these options looked like door prizes. So trying to look like I had confidence and not just indigestion, I pointed to the bundle of sticks. The woman holding it nodded, then tossed it into the fire pit beside us. The wood exploded in green flame. I kid you not. Green. Everyone watched the smoke rise, and then the white-haired man with the snake said, "Speak truth," or "Be burned by lies." So now, I'm in the middle of a tribal bonfire circle, with green fire, a live snake, and the vague threat of honesty-based combustion. I mean, what else is new? The woman motioned for me to speak. Truth, Soraya said quietly beside me. One only. From your past. I swallowed. There were a dozen things I could say. Some deep, some dumb. But my brain went sideways, and I blurted, when I was 9, I pretended my dog ran away. But really, I left the gate open on purpose, because I wanted to see what would happen. There was silence. Then the fire changed the color, back to orange, and everyone nodded. That was it. Test passed. Apparently, honesty beats shame, even if it's weirdly specific, and involves childhood pet abandonment. After the ceremony, we ate together. Communal meals were quiet, but full of meaning. People passed food clockwise. Water was shared from the same cup. Every action was deliberate. You don't realize how chaotic your old life was until you're suddenly living in a place where every hand gesture means something. That evening, I sat by the main fire with Soraya and asked, what was the point of that test? To see if your memory is heavy, she said. What if it is? She shrugged. Then we help you carry it. One of the kids interrupted us by shoving a stick in my face. On it, a roasted cricket. Again. You eat, he said. Didn't I pass already? He just grinned like a tiny demon. So I ate it. Odd fact, crickets contain nearly twice the protein of beef per gram. Also, they taste marginally better when not waved in your face by a child with malicious joy. Later, as the fire crackled and shadows stretched long across the trees, Soraya leaned toward me. There is one more test, she said. Of course there is. She smiled faintly. This one, you take alone. She led me down a path lit by faint flickers, tiny lanterns made from tree sap and hollowed fruit. They glowed like fireflies in jars. At the end of the path stood a small hut, round low, with only a single mat inside and one clay bowl. You stay until sun, she said. No food, no sleep, only dream. I laughed. You want me to dream? She nodded. To remember. You guys keep saying that. Like I'm supposed to recall a whole life I never lived. Soraya stepped forward and placed a hand over my heart. You lived. You just don't know where you left it. I didn't know if that was wise or vaguely insulting, but I agreed. She shut the door behind me, and then I was alone. The hut was thick with the scent of sage and crushed bark. The silence was dense, like the walls held it in. I sat. I waited. Hours passed. I could feel the forest outside shift as the moon moved, as animals rustled, as something ancient paced between trees. At one point, I swear the bowl started glowing, just faintly. That's when I slipped into something not sleep, not wakefulness. Call it remembering. I saw flashes, trees glowing from the inside, children with silver eyes, a woman, Soraya, holding a bundle that pulsed with light, a sky that bent, and then a door hanging in the air, not attached to anything, just there. When I opened it in the vision, I heard my own voice say, "Don't come back," and I woke up gasping. The sun was rising. The door creaked open, and Soraya stood there. You saw, she asked. I nodded. Then the forest has spoken. She helped me up, and I stumbled outside. Odd fact for you. Some indigenous Amazonian tribes use natural hallucinogens, like ayahuasca, to induce spiritual journeys. It's not about getting high. It's about seeing truth. A rite of passage. Historians still debate whether dreams have encoded memory or are just random brain static. But I can tell you this. That door, I've seen it before. In a dream I had when I was 6. The one that made me scream at the stars. It didn't rain that night, but everything was wet in the morning. The trees, the soil, even the air. Like the forest had sweat through its sheets. Soraya didn't knock, didn't wait. She just stepped into my hut and whispered, "Today, no trails." That meant no clearing, no village center, no familiar landmarks. We were going deep. I followed her with zero hesitation and about 10% understanding. We left behind the familiar fire smoke paths and entered a part of the forest that didn't want to be walked. The ground sucked at my boots like it had opinions. Vines clawed across the trail. Even the birds went silent as if they'd been warned. Soraya didn't look back. She moved fast for someone who always seemed half ancient. I jogged to keep up. We passed a tree so thick I could have stood inside the hollow. Then another with red moss, shaped like fingers. Then one covered in scratch marks that looked far too intentional. You sure this is safe? I asked. She glanced over her shoulder. No. Cool. Love that for us. But she didn't stop. After maybe 2 hours or 15 minutes, it was hard to tell we reached a space where the light bent. Not metaphorically. I mean, the actual sunlight seemed to warp, twisting between the branches like water seen through broken glass. "Don't speak," she whispered. So I didn't. Soraya knelt and placed her palm on the ground. Her eyes closed. She murmured something in her language, 3 soft syllables over and over. Then she stood and pointed. Look. At first, I saw nothing. Just trees, ferns, a few mushrooms that probably had strong opinions about my liver. But then the trees moved, or more accurately, the space between them shifted. The entire forest rearranged itself like a slide puzzle. Roots twisted, stones rolled aside, and suddenly we were standing on the edge of a perfectly symmetrical path lined with stones. "Where does it go?" I whispered, forgetting her rule. She didn't answer. We walked. This part of the forest was dead silent, not quiet empty. Even the insects gave it a wide berth. And the path beneath our feet wasn't stone, it was bone. Polished white vertebrae, laid end to end like stepping stones. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt home. Soraya stopped at a stone pillar covered in carvings, not Eshonai symbols, not anything I recognized. These were spirals, nested within spirals, interlocking knots that hummed if I stared too long. Some parts looked like circuitry, others like constellations. She touched one carving and whispered, "Your name." I blinked. "That symbol is me." She nodded. "From before." "Before forgetting." "Before what, Soraya?" She turned slowly and met my eyes. "Before the forest closed." There's a theory I'd heard once on a late-night podcast that some ancient societies simply disappeared because their land withdrew. Like the forest itself, folded inward and sealed its people inside. Not wiped out, just erased from the visible world. That theory never made sense to me. Until now, we stepped past the pillar into a clearing filled with stacked stones, hundreds of them, some taller than me, all arranged in deliberate patterns. Circles, spirals, lines that pointed skyward. Soraya led me to one of the stones, touched it gently, and said, "You were born here." I didn't respond because I remembered something. Not a clear scene, just heat, a sound like bees inside a jar, the feel of moss against baby skin, a woman humming, and that same spiral stone. I'd buried it so deep it had become a myth in my own head, a false dream I'd chalked up to childhood imagination. But it was real. Soraya pointed at the moss growing along one stone's base. Carved into it so faint I wouldn't have seen it if she hadn't shown me was a shape. My scar. Eyebrow. Jagged. Precise. Someone had carved my scar into stone before I was old enough to hold a chisel. "What does this mean?" I asked. "It means," she said, "you are the last one who saw the gate open." Odd fact of the day. The Voynich manuscript, an illustrated codex of unknown origin and language, has baffled historians for over a century. Some think it's a hoax. Others think it's a forgotten language. No one knows. It just exists. Standing there in the spiral grove, as I later started calling it, I understood how something could be real ancient and completely outside history's grasp, because the Eshonai hadn't just hidden their people. They'd hidden space. "Why show me this now?" I asked. Soraya answered without looking at me. "Because the forest stirs. It remembers you." On our way back, we didn't take the same path. The bone road vanished the moment we turned our backs. The light stopped warping. Everything reset. But something followed. Not footsteps, not sound, just presence. That night, I stayed awake long after everyone else fell asleep. I stood outside my hut and stared at the sky, except the stars weren't where they were supposed to be. I don't mean, "Ooh, pretty constellation." I mean, whole constellations were missing. Orion was gone. The North Star had shifted. The night above me wasn't the night I'd grown up with. I asked Soraya about it in the morning. She said only, "You are not meant to return yet." "Return where?" She pressed her fingers to my temple. "To this side. Not the forest. Not the village. Something else." Historians still debate whether ancient people had access to parts of the world, geographic, spiritual, or dimensional, that we no longer understand. Lost corridors, thin places, cracks in the fabric. I used to roll my eyes at that kind of talk, but not anymore. Because I'd seen the forest shift. I'd walked the path of bone, and the stars overhead were whispering something I couldn't yet understand. I woke to drums, not ceremonial, not rhythmic, more like alarm bells. The entire village was moving, fast. Children being ushered into huts, elders standing at doorways with staffs, hunters stringing bows and dipping arrows into something thick and black. Soraya pulled me aside, without a word, and handed me a bundle. Inside were flatbread dried roots and a carved pendant shaped like a spiral, overlaid with what looked like an eye. "What's going on?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed the pendant into my palm and said, "Do not lose this. It sees when you can't." Then she turned and joined the others, gathering at the edge of the trees. I followed, because apparently I'm very bad at understanding what stay here means. At the forest's edge, something buzzed, not like insects, like electricity. The hair on my arms rose. Every bird was silent. The leaves trembled. Then I saw it, a black shape hovering just above the treetops. Not a drone. Bigger, oval, silent, sleek, and somehow old. Like metal from a forgotten age. The villagers didn't attack. They sang, low and steady. Their voices merged into a single vibration. You could feel it in your bones. The object, whatever it was, hovered a few seconds longer, then retreated, sliding backwards through the air like someone hitting rewind. I exhaled. "What was that?" Soraya said, "A watcher." "A watcher of what?" She looked up at the trees, of cracks. The next hours were tense. No one explained. Everyone just kept working, fortifying, watching the sky. I tried asking questions, but every time Soraya shut me down with a raised palm. Finally, she brought me to a hut I hadn't seen before, round darker, covered in hanging bones and feathers. It smelled like ash and rain. Inside sat a man I hadn't seen until that day. He was blind, or at least his eyes were covered with a cloth stained in red clay. His skin was marked with symbols, unlike the rest. Sharper, more angular. Soraya said, "This is the teller of stories, of ends." Cool. Love a cheerful job title. The teller motioned for me to sit. Then he reached toward me without looking and placed a hand on my chest. It was warm and dry. Then he spoke. "You carry two names. Excuse me, one you know, one you've buried." I didn't have anything clever to say. He leaned closer. "The second name, the forest still calls it." Then he began to chant, not in Eshonai tongue, but in something else. Guttural harsh, like a cracked flute in a sandstorm. I felt dizzy. The room tilted. Not just metaphorically, the actual walls shifted. And then I saw it. A vision. Me, as a child, running, screaming, not from danger, but toward something. A tree that glowed from within. A woman, my mother, calling out in a voice that echoed backward. Then silence. I blinked and the vision vanished. Soraya helped me up. The teller was gone. Just gone. No smoke, no fade out. 1 second he was there, the next only air. "What just happened?" I whispered. "You saw the first break," she said. "The what?" "When the world split." Here's a historical wrinkle for you. There's an old Hopi prophecy about the world being divided into separate paths, one of greed and machinery, one of nature and balance. The idea is that we're always drifting between worlds, but only a few notice when the switch happens. Maybe that's what I had felt my entire life, that off-kilter hum under the surface, the sense that I didn't quite fit. Soraya led me to the altar at the village center, a massive slab of stone ringed with carvings, some fresh, some faded into whispers. She placed her hand on a specific stone. "This was not always an altar," she said. "It was a door." A door to where? To then, As she spoke, she slid her fingers into a crease between the stones. With a grunt, she pulled, and a section shifted, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Of course, I followed her. At this point, it was either that or admit I was a character in a fever dream. The stairway spiraled downward, carved into earth and root. The walls were covered in finger marks, thousands, maybe more, like people had clawed their way up or down. At the bottom, a single chamber. In the center, something wrapped in hide and bound in vines. Soraya stepped forward and peeled back the layers. Inside was a mirror, but not just any mirror. It shimmered like oil on water, reflecting not light, but movement. I looked into it and saw myself, but younger. Not much, just slightly. Same face, different clothes. The me that had left something behind. This, Soraya whispered, is memory. Mine. She shook her head. Everyone's. The forest keeps it. I reached out. My fingers passed through, and suddenly I was back in the spiral grove. Only this time the stones were broken. The sky overhead was red. People were screaming. I was running, carrying something. A child? No, a bundle of light. It pulsed. Then something ripped through the air. A flash, a crack, and then nothing. Back in the chamber, I was sweating, shaking. Soraya helped me sit. You saw, she said. I think I saw the moment I left. She nodded. The moment you broke the gate. What gate? She said nothing. Because maybe some answers you don't get in words. Odd fact, the concept of thin places exists in many cultures, locations where the veil between worlds is weaker. Ancient Celts believed foggy moors and twisted forests were entrances to the other world. Historians still debate whether cultural memory is metaphor or echo. I think it's both. Because down in that chamber, watching myself run from a broken sky, I realized something. I didn't just leave the forest once. I broke it. I didn't sleep that night, not just because of what I'd seen, but because the forest wouldn't let me. Every shadow looked like it was leaning in. Every breeze sounded like breath. The trees whispered, not leaves rustling whispers. Soft syllables in no language I recognized. Maybe not meant to be understood. Maybe just meant to be heard. I sat outside Soraya's hut, the pendant she gave me, clutched in one hand, the memory of the mirror burning in the other. You broke the gate. Those words played in my head like a scratched vinyl, over and over. At dawn, Soraya joined me. She didn't sit, just stood there, quiet, waiting for me to say it. I saw myself carrying something I finally said. A child, or light, or both. She nodded once. What was it? She didn't answer. So I asked the only question that mattered. Can I fix it? She looked up at the trees. No, not the answer I wanted. But then she added, but you can end it. End what? The watching. That word again. Watcher. I thought of the black shape in the sky, of the stars that weren't where they were supposed to be, of the broken gate. It wasn't just about me. The forest wasn't sick. It was guarded. That night, the Esh and I gathered in silence. No songs, no fire, just eyes on me. Soraya painted 3 new lines on my face. Unlike the others, these curved backward, toward my ears, as if to remind me that the past was not behind, it was calling. I was given a staff, not a weapon, a marker, and a map of sorts, 6 stones, each one carved with a different symbol, arranged in a spiral. The instructions were clear. Follow the path. Return what was lost. Seal what was broken. Simple, right? Except every step forward made the world feel heavier, the air denser, the forest more awake. By the time I reached the second stone, the sky had turned pale orange. Not from the sun, just light, wrong light. At the third, I began hearing voices, mine, Soraya's, my mother's, saying things they hadn't said, or maybe things they would say. By the fourth stone, I was crying and didn't know why. By the fifth, I almost turned back. But the sixth waited, in a clearing I'd never seen. A perfect circle. Silent. Empty. Except for the thing standing at its center. It was me. No joke. Me a little older. Eyes darker. Wearing clothes I'd never owned. Holding nothing. He looked up, and he said, "You shouldn't have returned." I froze. "This isn't your path anymore," he said. "You sealed it. Let it rot." "I'm trying to fix it," I said. "You're trying to make sense of a story that doesn't belong to you anymore." I stepped forward. "Then whose story is it?" He pointed behind me. I turned and saw Soraya. Only she wasn't real. Just a shape. A memory. Behind her, dozens of others, all looking at me. I turned back to the doppelganger, but he was gone. Only the final stone remained. I knelt and placed the pendant on it. There was a sound like paper tearing underwater. The light shifted. The spiral closed. And then silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't echo. The forest exhaled. When I returned to the village, it wasn't there. Gone. Every hut, every path, even the spiral grove, all vanished. Only the trees remained. But the mark on my face, the 3 curved lines, was still there. And in my pocket, the pendant, still warm. Odd fact, in Norse mythology, the god Heimdall was the watchman of the gods guarding the boundary between realms. He had ears so sharp he could hear grass grow. Historians still debate whether myth was meant to explain the physical world or warn us about the ones we've forgotten. Weeks later, I was found by a rescue team near the highway. I didn't explain. What would I say? Hi. Yes, I broke a magical time-space gate in a hidden forest tribe. And now I think I'm a part of multiple timelines. No thanks. Back home, things are the same, but I'm not. I still wake at 3:23 a.m., the exact minute I cross the 6th stone. I still hear whispers when the wind shifts just right. And the pendant, it glows when I dream. So yeah, I left the forest, but part of me never did.